We now switch to macroeconomics. So far, we've been looking at microeconomics, we look at individuals, but now we're going to look at macroeconomics, where the focus will be on the whole economy rather than on individual market and how they operate. Although the way of thinking between issues is very similar, and we may use similar tools in order to study and reflect upon our policies, but what we will change will be now the lenses, the whole economy rather than individual market or individual consumer or individual product. When we look at any economy's standard of living is dependent on the quantity of resources that they have. And in this regard, the national income, which is the total value of the country's final output of all goods and services produced in a year, is a very useful calculation. National income is basically calculated through GDP, which is the total amount of goods and services produced in an economy during a time period. This is one of the most important economic indicators used in judging the performance of an economy. When it comes to the measurement of national income, we actually take three approaches to measure national income: the expenditure approach, the income approach, and the output approach. In the expenditure approach, we add up all the expenditure undertaken in the economy during a period. And this may include various items purchased by household, the expenditure by firms on capital equipment, even spending by government, and net export spending. In other words, we look at the aggregate expenditure, which is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now we can notice this, that in our calculation we have the expenditure by foreigners on domestic goods, but we also then subtract domestic residents expenditure on imported goods to find out the net expenditure, which is the net export that is part of our aggregate expenditure. Now, in this approach, what we get is what we call GDP at market prices, which means that there is indirect taxes and subsidies in this calculation of GDP at market prices, which may not be the same as the cost of making this output or expenditure. And that's why sometimes we may need to do an adjustment to find GDP at factor cost. This means that GDP at factor cost will be equal to GDP at market prices, which we found here, but then we subtract indirect taxes, which is probably going to artificially increase the market price, and add subsidies, which is artificially lowering the market price. So when we find GDP at factor cost, that will be very relevant because it will match with our answers that we'll get from the other two approaches, which is the output approach and the income approach. Now, when we look at the income method or income approach, we are measuring the total amount of income received by people in a country in the form of the various incomes like wages, salaries, profits, rents, dividends, and so on. And in this approach, we are looking at how households are earning their income. In other words, it tells us something about the balance between rewards of labor, which is wages and salaries, capital, which is interest, land has a rent, and enterprise has profits, and so on. Now, in using this measure, it is really important for us to make sure we only use those payments that are received in return for providing a good or service. So transfer payments, which are transfer of payments against which no output is produced in return, is not included. For example, unemployment benefits, pension, student grants are ignored from this approach. The last approach to look at is the output approach, where we add up the total amount of output produced by firms in an economy. Now here we need to be making sure that there is no double counting taking place, which means that we don't add the output of each firm two times. So for example, if the value of cars sold by car manufacturer is added to the value of output of, for example, tire firms, double counting can occur if you're already put the value of car that has tires included in it. Instead, we just count the value which is added at each stage, or we count the final value, which means we ignore all the value addition on each stage. For example, if a manufacturer sells a television to a retailer for $200 and the retailer then sells it to the consumer for $300, the television has not added $500 to the GDP. In fact, the final value is only 300, and the value added at each stage is 200 by the manufacturer and 100 by the retailer, which also comes to 300. So what we do is either we look at value added at each stage, which is 200 plus 100, or just the final value, which is 300. If you like the content you just saw and all the other content that is on my website, then you need to head over to altacademy.org, where you will find more content not only of my subject but also 5 other subjects. So go there.